next speaker is a thoughtful and gracious commentator on culture and the Christian faith. He has a passion for both the philosophical and the personal, drawing on his background as a graduate architect, a primary school teacher, a missionary, and a young adult pastor. He's the research and features editor of the Daily Declaration, one of Australia's largest independent Christian news sites. He's fluent in several Southeast Asian languages and has degrees in design, education, and divinity. He's also the author of the excellent book, Cross and Culture: Can Jesus Save the West? Please welcome Kurt Mahlburg.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Cody. Again, I feel like that was a very gracious introduction, and I hope I live up to it. And they are very big shoes to fill from James, so I'll do my best. But it is awesome to be with you guys, and thank you so much as well to Dave for organising today and for Moree Baptist for hosting us. So how to beat big tech and big media? What a topic. How do you solve all the world's problems in, 25 minutes? But I want to start with a bit of audience interaction, so get your arms ready. First of all, put your hand up if you are concerned that social media platforms are censoring good information, true information. That's a lot of hands. What about, put your hand up if you've ever been personally censored or kicked off of social media? What a well-behaved crowd. Well done. There are a few though. Put your hand up if you generally keep up with the news. Yep. And put your hand up if you generally trust mainstream reporting. Yeah, there's not too many hands there. Well, with that last question, you are certainly in good company. If you're feeling a little bit distrustful of big tech and big media, there's a lot of people like you. And this is just the results of a survey that was taken globally, so nations throughout the world asking how much they trust their media. It came back with pretty bad results for Western countries. So Australia, 43% of people trust their media. In the USA, it's even lower at 39%, and I've actually seen surveys that put the US as low as 36%. So it's kind of concerning. Now, it's not to say that really high levels of trust are a good thing either. If you can read that really small writing at the top, the country with the most trust is China, 80%. So I don't think they probably should trust their media quite as much as they do. So it is healthy to have a level of skepticism. But I would argue that we Westerners actually have the opposite problem. And when only 43, in the case of the US, 36% of people feel like the media is telling them the truth, we're in a bit of trouble. And I guess the freedom of the press, if you really think about it, the freedom of the press is a pillar of democracy. Without it, we can't function. Our way of life as Australians is one that absolutely depends on a free press, on a press that properly scrutinises government and also our other big institutions. We need a press that genuinely speaks on behalf of ordinary citizens. And the lesson of history, if you think about the regimes of history, last century especially, any country that doesn't have a free press has a government that won't be held to account and ultimately is going to pave way for tyranny. So a free press is incredibly important. Now, you may not have thought about this connection before, but I think there's a really close sort of analogy between the press or the media and the Old Testament concept of a prophet. It's a very biblical concept, this idea of the free press. In ancient Israel, God raised up prophets to hold Israel's leaders accountable without fear or favour. The Old Testament prophets were the mouthpiece for God, and as such, they were the mouthpiece for truth. Now, they would give divine affirmation of a leader, a king, or the whole nation when they were doing the right thing. But when they did the wrong thing, when that nation went astray, when that king went astray, that prophet that God sent would be absolutely ruthless and would set the record straight and speak for God. Now, I'm not saying there's a perfect analogy here. Journalists are not speaking on God's behalf, and the office of an editor or a journalist is certainly not a God-appointed role in that same sense. But I would argue that free press, this idea of a free press in our democracies, very much grew out of that concept from the Bible. It's been influenced by other things, but we've got a Christian foundation in our culture, and that was a big influence on this idea of the free press. Since our founding, nations like Australia and the US have a built-in trust that the media is going to fulfill its role and is going to hold each government to account. It doesn't matter what party they're from. If they tell the truth, if they do the right thing, that will be reported fairly, and if they need to be held to account, they will be. For much of our history, and especially last century, the 20th century, that worked pretty well. I mean, it's never been a perfect thing, but it worked fairly well because our nations had a strong Christian consensus. If not everyone was a Christian, at least most people thought of truth as being objective. And they thought that the media's role was to tell the truth, and they could trust what the media was going to say. Now, this didn't happen perfectly, like I said, but one thing is for sure, the levels of trust in the media used to be a lot higher than they are now. Now, I'm not sure if you've noticed, but the Christian consensus has definitely faded a lot. And in its place, we now have postmodernism, this idea that there is no such thing as objective truth. Something can be true for you, something else can be true for me. They might be absolutely at odds with each other and contradict, but it's fine, we're all kind of happy. That's the way postmodernism works, that's the way people think. And without Christianity in the way, now people think we can sort of explore our own ideas, think what we want, make up our own truth. But ideas have consequences. The thing is, many of our newsrooms today, many of our journalists have gone through a university system that has taught them postmodernism. They've been taught to think in a postmodern way. And so now, if a journalist or an editor thinks and feels strongly enough about something, well, they probably assume that that thing is true. And they don't think to interrogate their own bias. And that's a real problem. For many in the profession, the journalism and editing kind of profession, their career has become a way to express themselves and to, explain what they like and what they're passionate about and how they can kind of influence the world with that and sort of shape public opinion. Many have abandoned the goal of non-partisanship, of holding governments to account and holding ideas to account, like James talked about, without fear or favour. So this idea, I think, as consumers of journalism, we assume it is what it used to be. In fact, it's become something very different. It's become this kind of way for journalists and editors to express their opinion and to shape public perception. Now, not all journalists and editors behave this way. We need to be careful that we don't sort of just disregard everyone. There are still some excellent people in media who go after the truth at all costs. I want to talk about a few of these names. I wrote about them in an article. I'll show you that article in a minute. But some of these really big names in media went after the truth in the year 2020, which was just the craziest year, we can really imagine. And they ended up getting muscled out of their own publications. So going from left to right, top left is a guy called Glenn Greenwald. He founded a paper or an online journal called The Intercept. But when the other editors wouldn't let him expose corruption in the Biden family, he basically was muscled out of that role and he ended up having to resign. Matt Taibbi, top right, resigned as an editor at the Rolling Stone. He was critical of how intolerant the press had become to anything that challenged their viewpoints, and so he ended up having to quit his role. Then Bari Weiss quit the New York Times. She basically was bullied after giving conservative ideas a fair hearing, and she just felt like her job was no longer tenable. So she actually published a very famous resignation letter, which you can still read online. It was quite a fascinating kind of period. And then it was only a few days or maybe a week later, another guy, Andrew Sullivan, resigned from The New Yorker after fellow staffers turned on him for opposing critical race theory. So there are some really brave voices in media. The problem is they're starting to get kicked out of their papers. All four of these people are excellent journalists. 3 of them actually happen to be gay. Probably they weren't gay enough by the sounds of it. But they all blew the whistle on how intolerant and how narrow-minded the field of journalism had become. If you want to read more about their stories, this is the article I wrote. You can look it up at the Daily Declaration. But these 4 are just a sampling of some of the excellent journalists that are getting punished, sadly, for telling the truth. The fact is that today's newsrooms are crowded with woke progressive elites who live in a totally different world from most of their readers. The result is a media echo chamber, where many in the press just tell themselves and they tell each other what they want to hear. Now consider just a few examples. If you remember that very bumpy ride that was the Donald Trump presidency, you would have noticed that the media was particularly harsh on him. One study actually found that 94% of cable news coverage of Donald Trump was negative. 94%. Now that Joe Biden is in office, the coverage is overwhelmingly positive. But if you think about some of the things that have happened under the Biden presidency, the Taliban has overrun Afghanistan, Russia has invaded Ukraine, 5 million people have entered the US illegally through the southern border. 5 million people, that's like a fifth of our population in Australia, just flooding in. There's inflation and fuel prices that are absolutely out of control. The cost of living has soared for Americans. I know, I'm married to an American. We were there in April and May, and prices are just crazy at the moment. But according to the media, Biden is every man's hero. Look at how our ABC covers him. We're told that he's saving the planet, he's tackling inflation, he's trailblazing on healthcare, and he's putting historic political wins on the board. Remember how the media pointed out every little gaffe of Trump's? You know, he'd say the wrong thing, he'd sort of step the wrong direction, whatever. Biden falls asleep on TV. He checks his watch at military funerals. He keeps thinking Kamala Harris is president. He walks away from hard questions. He'll literally just exit a press conference when he's being asked questions, falls off his bike, and we hardly hear a whisper about it. You don't have to like Trump to see the double standard here. Now, I haven't even scratched the surface of media bias about Trump. I want to dig into it just a little bit more, looking at Trump as a bit of a case study. If you assumed the news was telling the truth about Trump, you would have believed that Trump called neo-Nazis very fine people. That was a story that circulated for I don't know how many weeks. Wasn't true at all. Wasn't true at all. But that's what the media said. If you believed the press was telling the truth about Trump, you would have thought that he suggested people drink bleach as a cure for COVID-19. That never happened either. If you believed the press, you would have thought that Trump had protesters cleared from outside of the White House so that he could go and pose for a photo op with the Bible. That also never happened as the media reported it. I mean, these stories were just basically made up out of whole cloth. If you trusted the media, you would have thought that Donald Trump was actually a Russian asset, a Manchurian candidate who had been put into power by the Kremlin, by Russia, to keep Hillary Clinton out of office. That is a story, that's a smear that the media ran with for 4 years in American media, and it was picked up here by our press without question. The ABC especially covered that story for 4 years and assumed it to be true. In the end, so basically they had to do a big investigation to see if this was the case. $32 million was spent on this investigation. It was discovered that the so-called evidence for that was fake, and it was actually paid for by Hillary Clinton's campaign. Not only that, but the FBI helped launder that lie to the media. It was just crazy. Probably the worst example of all, when we're still looking kind of at this issue of Trump, was the Hunter Biden laptop scandal. Now, I don't know if you followed this. If you don't follow American politics, this might be a little bit over your head. So I'll just try to break it down very briefly. Just weeks before the 2020 election, a laptop turned up that appeared to belong to Hunter Biden, the son of Joe Biden, the son of the now president. Now, it had evidence of vast Biden family corruption, basically monetizing their surname, their White House connections, in order to make millions of money from corrupt countries overseas. Now, the laptop and the evidence on it for this corruption was 100% real and verifiable. But the media refused to cover the story because they feared that if they did, Biden would lose to Trump in the election. Now then, that was absolutely just horrible that the media was not willing to tell the truth on this. But it got worse. Big tech got involved. So Twitter and Facebook locked the account of the New York Post. That's the paper that broke this story. And they did huge amounts of reporting on it. All of their articles were blocked. Their accounts were blocked by social media, by Twitter and Facebook. And they censored anyone who tried to share it. If that's not election interference, I don't know what is. Now, again, you don't have to like Donald Trump. You can hate him all you like. I'm not even here to defend him. I'm just looking at him as a case study. But if this isn't high-level corruption, if this isn't absolute treachery from big media and big tech, I don't know what is. Matt Taibbi, I mentioned him earlier, he calls this the Sovietization of the American press. He's not even a conservative, but actually he's lived in a few different ex-Soviet countries. He's lived in Russia and Uzbekistan and a couple of other places. He writes that coverage of Biden increasingly resembles official press releases, often featuring embarrassing Soviet-style contortions. That's kind of scary. We tend to think of that type of corruption as being somewhere else, somewhere in the third world, somewhere in ex-communist countries, but it's very much taking place right now in Western media. Another example of this kind of bias we saw actually during the 2020 George Floyd riots. There's a couple of people laughing because they've seen this screenshot before, There's a guy reporting in, I think it's just outside of Milwaukee, flames, buildings on fire, cars on fire, and what does the title at the bottom say? Fiery but mostly peaceful protests. This is, the media has rightly been critical of the January 6th raid. That was a disgusting act. It was shocking. And we haven't heard the end of that saga. But in 2020, over $1 billion of damage was caused in hundreds of American cities. Mobs rioted all through the summer. 32 people were killed. Some of them were beaten to death in public, on camera. And they were called mostly peaceful protests because they were basically sort of promoting a left-wing cause, so-called racial justice. I'm sorry, that is not media. That is pure propaganda. That's the level of dishonesty that we are facing. Now, I make no apologies for focusing on America. A lot of our news comes to us from America. Australian culture is incredibly influenced by American culture, so I think it is important for us to be aware of what's happening there because it trickles down into Australia. But if we were to turn to Australia, the situation really isn't much better. This is a survey that was taken, it was a little while ago, not quite a decade ago, so I think probably things are worse now than when the survey was taken. But it was asking Australian journalists which political party, they would be voting for at the coming federal election. Now, basically, if you look at Fairfax, so that's like The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, 9 News, lots of others, the bias was pretty bad. 75% of Fairfax journalists favoured a Labor-Greens government, while only 20% said they would vote for the coalition. I mean, where's the balance there? The bias was actually the worst at the ABC. This is, taxpayers, that's you and I, are funding this to the tune of $1.3 billion a year. And over at the ABC, over 41% said they'd vote for the Greens. I mean, this is a tiny little party that has about 8 or 10% of the vote of the country, and yet it's 4 times that rate of the number of journalists at the ABC are voting for the Greens. 32% favoured Labor, so the Greens was even more popular than Labor at the ABC, and less than 15% indicated support for the centre-right coalition. Now, with numbers like this, there is no wonder that we are seeing the kind of bias in our reporting that we've been talking about. When a leader is favoured by the press and they're in office, then we know that we can expect fluff pieces and just, kind of lavish praise, all of that sort of thing, and very low levels of account keeping. When a leader is disliked by the press, doesn't matter if they're doing a fantastic job and all the numbers are looking great, they will be scrutinised at every turn because the press is really no longer about telling the truth. This is just the way things are. I mean, I'm not here to sort of, say this is like basically like James was saying, what we feel about things isn't really relevant. What's happening is what's relevant. We need to focus on the facts and not the feelings. A guy who is able to do this very well, one of my favourite authors actually, is Francis Schaeffer. He warned as early as 1977. He said, when the perspective and the worldview of the elite coincides with some of the influential news carriers, does not have to be all, then either consciously or unconsciously, the media becomes an instrument for manipulation. He said that over 50 years ago. So let's return to the comparison I made at the start between journalists and Israel's prophets. The thing with Israel is that they weren't just true prophets from God, there were also false prophets. I believe we are now in a situation where many, many people in the media, whether they're conscious of it or not, are actually playing the role of a false prophet. They have the nation's trust, as in Israel's day, but they've traded truth for their own opinions, and they're spinning it as truth. Now, Dave has actually personally been on the pointy end of this. I was actually there to witness it. So we had a church and state in Brisbane last year, and a Sydney Morning Herald journalist wrote a smear piece about that event. He wasn't actually there. I was talking to Dave about this last night. He wasn't there. He got the information secondhand from a Satanist who was in the audience. And then he wrote a piece in the... Oh, he wasn't there either. Okay, so this is like third or fourth or fifth hand information. Chinese whispers that involved a Satanist and essentially a gay activist who was working for the Sydney Morning Herald. And in his article, he took a whole bunch of quotes out of context, made it sound as though there was a political revolution brewing in Australia, and that basically the attendees at that conference were about to grab their pitchforks and run down to Parliament House in Canberra and stage our own January 6th event. This is kind of the way that this article read. Now, the saddest part about all of this was that a well-known Christian news site picked up the story, the Sydney Morning Herald story, believed it, wrote another piece, another hit piece against church and state, against Dave and against the speakers who were there. And like I said, I was sitting there in the audience, so I saw everything, and there was absolutely no hint of this at all. Now, if they'd bothered to check, the thing is, now, like I mentioned, there was a Christian news site that picked up the story and wrote their own hit piece. If these guys were fellow Christians, if they had bothered to ask Dave, they had his phone number, if they'd bothered to ring him and ask him what happened, they would have known the truth. If they'd bothered to check the social media profile of that Sydney Morning Herald journalist, they would have realised that essentially he's a gay rights activist and he hates Christians, and he's been posting about him hating, his hatred for Christians for years. This is one of the really big challenges with big media and big tech today. See, it's not just telling us untruths, it's actually dividing the church. I think some of the biggest divisions that we have in the church today are an issue of media telling lies and Christians sadly believing them. And so I have a real heart for the church, understanding this issue, waking up to it, and wising up to the fact that so much of what is being said now by our mainstream media is not true. And if we can unite on that and work out what the truth is, we're going to see a whole lot more unity in the body of Christ. I'm very passionate about that issue. Christians who routinely believe that the fake news that is being spouted by the media are actually being encouraged to turn on their brothers and sisters in Christ. That's a real concern. The lies of the false prophets in media are hurting the church. Now, I empathise with Christians, especially I think of the boomer generation and up, who still look to the old guard media for truth. I empathise with them because that's what they grew up with. It was the case 20, 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, that the media generally could be trusted. Sure, there's always been bias, there's always been issues, but generally back then, things were a lot better and the media was a fair bit more trustworthy. That desire for an institution that has integrity and that goes after the truth and holds our leaders to account is a good desire to have. We should want that. But the simple fact is that it's no longer happening. Yes, the legacy media is still useful for many things, and I don't just mean propping the door open. Local events, sports, weather, there's a lot of things that the media does, services that it provides that are very good. And so we need to be careful that we don't kind of criticise everything and throw the baby out with the bathwater and overreact. But when it comes to politics and social issues especially, and moral issues, we must listen to these outlets as though they were seeking to influence our worldview and seeking to sway our vote, because that's exactly what they are trying to do. For years, the church has been wrestling with the question of how should we as Christians approach entertainment, movies and books and just all sorts of media stuff that's being thrown at us in terms of like leisure and entertainment. I think as Christians, we really need to start asking the question, how do I consume mainstream media as a Christian? That needs to be a discipleship point. I think churches should be preaching on that all the time because it's so important. So how can we beat big tech and big media? Well, the first big step is to know your enemy, which is why I've spent a fair bit of time talking about these issues so far. I've spent a fair bit of time trying to expose some of the bias and the corruption. We need to have concrete examples of the lies that have been told in order to hold the media to account, and also to share with our Christian brothers and sisters, to explain to them, do you understand that you've been lied to? Do you understand that the whole country's been lied to on various issues? The examples I've provided are glaring and obvious, the Trump stuff we looked at earlier, but often media bias is quite subtle. So I just want to give you 5 very quick points, things to be just aware of, to be a little bit more careful of. So the first one is beware of omission. Don't just pay attention to what the media covers, but pay attention to what it doesn't cover. So, the Hunter Biden laptop scandal is a perfect example of that. The media absolutely refused to cover that. Another one is, like, anytime there's kind of a flood event or some sort of a crazy weather event, that's reported as though climate change, is going to end the world. But what about when all the good weather's happening? Like, why is that not reported on, Beware of framing. This is another one. So pay attention to the words that are used. This is looking at that same slide we had at the start about some of these headlines about Joe Biden from ABC News. I've highlighted, I know it's a bit small, but I've highlighted some of the words that are used. Be careful about the way that adjectives, verbs, and nouns are chosen, because all of those are designed to tug on your heartstrings and to make people in the story look good or bad, to make ideas in the story look good or bad. So Joe Biden roasts Donald Trump. It's a star-studded event. We could look at all of those, but basically just be very careful at the sorts of words that are being used. It's at that smaller level where a lot of the media sort of sleight of hand happens. Another one is beware of relevance. Are the stories being published even of interest to everyday people? Or is some kind of an agenda being pushed? I don't know about you, but I've seen a lot of articles recently about eating bugs. Is there anyone that you talk to who says, I just can't wait for my next meal of bugs? Like there's no one around that wants to eat bugs, and yet we're being told, almost on a weekly or a whatever basis by some of these mainstream media outlets that eating bugs is the next best thing. Who's funding this? What are their aims? What are they trying to achieve here? So relevance is a really important one. Another one to be aware of is what I call the dialectic, the Neo-Marxist dialectic. Watch how the media changes its story over time. It follows a very predictable dialectic. First of all, it starts with denial. X is not happening, whatever that X might be. Men aren't in women's change rooms, whatever the thing that they're trying to deny. So first of all, it's not happening. Second of all, okay, it is happening, but it's not really that bad. The third step is, okay, it's happening and it's good. And the final step is you must be punished for disagreeing. So let's have a look at how it worked in the case of the US recession. The US at the moment is in a recession, 2 quarters of negative economic growth. Now, step 1, Biden says, God willing, I don't think we're going to see a recession. Step 2, yes, a recession looks inevitable, but it may not be that bad. Here's why. Step 3, is the US in a recession? Does it even matter? And step 4, I don't know if you caught this story, but basically Wikipedia allows obviously all users to kind of edit stuff, and their page that defined recession was edited by Biden users to change the definition of what a recession was, and then Wikipedia locked it so no one could change the definition back to what it originally was. So now there's widespread denial that the US is in a recession, even though it is, because the definition has been changed. There you go. Another one is to be aware of fact-checking. So basically, I would caution you that fact-checking, so-called fact-checking, is basically leftist journalism 2.0. It uses the same emotional appeals, the same political spin as all other content. Tell me, what is the difference between something that's mostly true and something that's partly false? I mean, by definition, anything that's mostly true is partly false. By definition, anything that's partly false is mostly true. The thing is, one sounds good and squishy and nice and warm, and the other sounds all really bad and naughty. Do you see what I'm saying? See the tricks that are being played here? These things are very subtle, but they are the tools being used to manipulate you, so be very aware of them. As well as knowing our enemy, we need to know our friends. So up on the screen are logos from some fantastic Australian Christian conservative, not all Christian, but most of them are, trusted news sites. And I would encourage you, if you take a photo, come ask me later on. Just take a note, because these are some fantastic up and coming news sites. Dave might want to mention some more later that I may have missed, but I would encourage you to get around these. Another on the next slide are some American sites. So if you follow American politics in general, this does cover fairly global content. These are some fantastic conservative, often Christian news sites that cover the news very well. So another practical tip I would give is to triangulate. If you're following a particular story, to work out what's really going on, see what the mainstream press is saying about it, see what the independent press is saying about it. And between those two, you'll probably work out what's really going on by triangulating. Recognise when the legacy media is telling the truth. Like I said earlier, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't want to overreact. We don't want to always assume they're lying, because in a lot of cases, they are just telling us what is going on. But I guess now I want to finish with a few practical steps. So work out how you want to wage war. So the question at the start was, how do we beat big tech and big media? Work out how you want to wage war. I'm going to suggest 3 options. The first is the low-key option. You might decide that for your own sanity, for your own mental health, you actually just need to tune out. Just turn it all off. That's fine. That's actually a very respectable choice. You might want to sort of still be on social media, but play a bit of a low-key role. And so what I'd say is be very careful who you follow, and who you unfollow, and who you follow back, and who you block. I use those buttons all the time. The block button, don't be afraid of it. It's your best friend if you're going to be on social media, for sure. The second option is to go next level. So that means being on social media, being a little bit engaged with it, but politely but firmly pushing back against some of the stuff that you're seeing. You can be a troll. You can sit there in the comment sections like a troll guarding the bridge and do it in a very lighthearted and kind of fun way. I like to do this all the time. Use the laugh response. Instead of liking a post, laugh at it. If you see a fake news post from big media, just leave a polite but well-reasoned comment that pushes back against it. Because all of that, I don't know if you've heard of the concept of ratioing, but if a post is commented on or shared a lot more than it's liked, it's an indication that that post is really silly and the person who made it shouldn't have made that post. It's called being ratioed. So by leaving lots of comments, by sharing it and kind of framing it in a different light, it's a very good indication that something is amiss and that basically bad attention is being drawn to that post. So we can add to that by essentially being friendly trolls. Use the clown emoji. Post a funny meme at the bottom that draws attention to the insanity in the article. We can actually make a difference with these things because these big media companies will start to realise we're being found out. Like we're lying straight to the public and we're being found out for it. That's a good thing if we can kind of tip the scales like that. Another option is to go for gold. So this is the kind of high-end option of you start a Facebook page of your own, and I don't just mean your profile. If you want to keep all your friends and anniversary pictures and stuff there, do that. But start another page with either your name or with, you just like start up a company or something like that, and post really good content. Share good news articles, share true articles, draw attention to some of the crazy stuff that's going on in culture. Build yourself a bit of a following. You might want to start a blog. You might want to produce some good content yourself, write thoughtful articles. Some of those Australian sites that I mentioned may even publish your articles. So I'm an editor at the Daily Declaration. We publish articles from everyday Christians all the time. So get in touch with me if you'd like to, if you think you want to put your writing skills to the test and you want to publish something, we'd love to consider that. A lot of the people who are in media at the moment started in some of the ways I've just described, by starting a Facebook post or a blog, started writing. So basically, sort of the world is your oyster. And one of the good things about big tech and big media at the moment is the lines are now quite blurred between actual journalists and just everyday people who are trying to kind of become up and coming writers. And a lot of the people, like I said, who are in journalism today, that's how they started. So there's some amazing opportunities before us. As James very aptly pointed out earlier on, the woke worldview is falling in on itself. It's caving in on itself. And secular people are looking for something more. They're looking for truth. They're looking for meaning. They're looking for purpose in their lives. And at the very bottom of it all, they are looking for God. And so we've got some amazing opportunities before us. And I'll address that a little bit more in our next session. Awesome. Thank you.